Let's talk about how video game reviews work right now and how influencers are potentially set up to change the way that this works. How does the review process work for video games? The short answer is it really does depend on how big your title is, how much contact you have with the press outlets, and even the genre that you are making. If you are a small indie studio, to a large degree, the review process is about getting eyes on your game. You don't have a lot of ins into the magazines and the websites and the influencers, so you really just want people to play your game and talk about it. To a large degree, it doesn't even necessarily matter if they give you a positive or negative review, because a lot of your spread is going to be from word of mouth. And these press outlets have a big reach. So if they talk about you, even if they give you a mediocre review, that's tens of thousands of people hearing about your game who otherwise might not. If you're small, often the right influencer is better than getting a review from an outlet. Often small indie games are going to get lower scores. They have smaller budgets, they have less reach, they have less content. This leads to slightly suppressed scores. Even if you get one influencer who hates your game and one influencer who loves your game, that one influencer who loves your game is going to have a much bigger reach than you otherwise would have had. And that could do you a lot more good than getting a 75 Metacritic is going to do you. As you get larger, you start to care a lot more about the actual scores. The score of record these days is for the most part Metacritic. Metacritic does an aggregation of all of the different review sites. I believe it's weighted based upon that site's impact through some secret Metacritic algorithm. I don't believe it's a pure average. If it is, please someone correct me down in the comments. As you get larger and people have already heard about your game, now this score starts to matter more. And I talked before about the scores and what they mean approximately. I'll link that video in this one as well. Typically, as we get into AA and AAA, there will be a process where the press gets their hands on a game before it's fully finished. There's a preview process. For most magazines, for most websites, their policy is that if you are going to a preview event, you will not be the person to write the review. This is seen as being a conflict of interest, and they're trying to avoid that perception of having there be a conflict of interest. Why is it a conflict of interest? Well, you are being treated to travel, a hotel, being wined and dined by the game maker in the preview event. This can color your ultimate review score. And the reality is it actually can color it either way. For some people, the fact that they were wined and dined means they're going to give that game a better score. For some people, they try so hard to be objective that they actually overcorrect and give it a worse score. So no one really wants this kind of influence in the review process because it's unpredictable. So the PR arms of the game developers don't really want these people reviewing the game either. Or if they do, if they are in fact going out and trying to influence their review scores by fancy trips and restaurant visits, they're taking a big risk of that blowing up in their face. So what typically happens for the reviews themselves is that the studio sends out early access review codes to the reviewers that they decide they want reviewing the game. And that's an important thing to state, is that they are deciding who they are sending those codes to, which of course is true. If you are making a video game about running a butcher shop, probably not sending a lot of codes to Vegan Recipes Monthly because you know they're not going to enjoy this kind of game. There's a certain degree of hunting going on for reviews. This happens at all of the major studios and really most of the minor ones as well, unless you, again, are so small that any press is increasing your reach. If you're caring about the score, you're going to consider who you are going to send those review codes to. This is really more about trying to avoid bad scores than hunting for good scores. Because the press outlets are outlets, they're organizations, you can't really guarantee who you're going to get as a reviewer. So you can't try to get that one guy you know loves your game, your IP, your style of development. You're really trying to suss out the particular biases of the organization as a whole and avoid the ones that are more likely to be unfavorable towards you. You have some idea of the way that different press outlets lean, and you're making decisions on codes based upon that. But what we've seen in more recent days is the rise of the influencer, the rise of people with their own YouTube channels who talk about video games being very important in the buying decisions of potential players. These kind of people have been around for quite a long time, but it's only in the last 5 years or so that they've been really integrated into the PR process. But in a lot of cases, these are people with no press background. What's happening is typically these YouTube channels are one person, or at least there's only a single face. So if someone is going to the preview event, it's the same person that would ultimately be reviewing the game. And that's introduced a bit of an issue. A lot of people like listening to influencers over press outlets because what they see are people talking more personally about their personal experiences. Now, I would argue that that is also the case for reviews at most press outlets, but there's an editorial staff. There's more process involved with a review at a press outlet than there is from an influencer. So that's absolutely true. We have seen a couple of times where influencers go to a preview event, express concerns about the game they are seeing, and then subsequently don't get early access codes to review the game, which from the perspective of the PR arm of the studio is fairly obvious because they're interpreting the things you were willing to say to them and using that to try to infer the score you might ultimately give the game. And then using that to decide that maybe they don't want you to be one of the first reviews on the game. And this is how it has worked arguably forever. This is how it works with movies. This is how it works with most things. The PR part of an organization is trying to make that score be as high as possible. Now, you might think this is kind of sus, isn't particularly ethical, and I can't completely disagree with you, but of course, this is what's going to happen. If you give an organization the ability to try to manipulate that score in an above board way, they're not paying for reviews. They're simply trying to cherry pick reviewers. They're going to do that. What we're seeing right now, because influencers are becoming bigger and bigger parts of the press for video games, is that influencers who haven't experienced being excluded from review codes, influencers who don't have a background in doing press, these influencers are getting excluded from review codes. And while this is to a large degree business as usual, they don't realize that it's business as usual. And as a result, are raising a big stink. And you might be thinking, well, they should raise a big stink. This isn't how this should work. What I would caution you is that this doesn't end up going the way you might hope. If you want the influencers to be really vocal when they end up getting excluded from review codes, for me, I only really see one outcome of this. And that's us going back to press that looks a lot more like it did 5-10 years ago, where it's entirely about the outlets that the studios trust more. Going back to the outlets that the studios understand how they're going to react. What ends up happening there is that influencers actually end up just being excluded completely. So you don't see what you're getting now, which is a whole bunch of people get to go to the preview event, and then some of those people get review codes and some of them don't. What instead you see is no influencers get to go to the preview events, just the press outlets get to go, and then no influencers get early access to reviews either. I don't think that's a future that any of us really want. I think we like the influencers that we listen to getting access to the games that we're interested in so that we can get their opinion on it. So what's the path forward here? I don't know that I actually have a great suggestion, because the two options that I see are either the influencers raise a big stink when they don't get a review code, and that makes the studios less likely to include them in the future, or the influencers remain silent on the fact that they didn't get review codes. And I think there's a risk there that their audience starts to potentially see them as complicit in what's going on. I do think the second one is probably more sustainable, and it might end up being where we end up landing. Maybe there's a world where influencers are involved in the pre-launch parts of the PR exercise, but not in the review itself, so that this conflict doesn't occur. That would require a very careful consideration from the studios to decide that that was how they wanted to proceed forward. I'm not sure if they have enough self-awareness to do that, but maybe that's a third option. There are a lot more influencers than there are press outlets remaining, so probably what will actually happen is this will end up being case by case. There will be certain influencers who get a reputation for being really tough, and they don't get early access to any review codes. And there will be some that will be known for playing ball, and they will get more access. They will get more behind the scenes. They'll get to see more things earlier. The reality is that there are kind of two things happening at a press outlet that are at odds with each other, which is partly why you have different people writing the review than doing the preview. The preview is a fluff piece. The studio is giving you early access behind the scenes, showing you stuff because they want potential players to get excited. And they're only interested in doing that with outlets or influencers who they feel are going to be excited or interested. Then on the other hand, you have reviews, and reviews are supposed to be more objective, more about helping players make buying decisions. And within the press outlets, there's a certain degree of a wall between these two organizations. Sometimes there's holes, certainly. Sometimes there is influence flowing between these two parts. But there's some attempt to keep them at least semi-independent from each other. But like I said, with an influencer, it's the same person. So that wall can't really exist. Maybe we end up in a world where some influencers get access for previews, but not early access for reviews. And other influencers who are seen more as review sites, review influencers, get access to reviews, but not early access for previews and the like. I honestly don't know where we're headed. One other thing to consider is that for very large games, really the upper 1% of games, so the GTAs, your Zeldas, your Call of Duties, there is a very strong anchoring effect on reviews. If GTA is getting all 10s and you want to give it a 6, you're doing that knowing there is going to be a pretty strong pushback on that score. In some cases, that's what you want. You want to be controversial. You want to draw traffic through that controversy. But for the most part, a very strong signal in the early reviews can end up influencing the later reviews. So while studios can't stop the more critical influencers and sites from reviewing their game forever, once it's launched, it's available for anyone to play and review. They can, to some degree, put some influence on those scores with who they decide to let do the early reviews. In the case of more controversial titles that have wide review score ranges, I don't think this actually has any effect at all, because there's a wide range of acceptable scores. If the early reviews contain 10 out of 10s and 6 out of 10s, you can pretty much give that game whatever you want. But if the early reviews are all 10 out of 10s, giving it a 6 out of 10 is a decision you are not making lightly. If the early reviews are all 6 out of 10s, giving it a 10 out of 10 is something that you have to be considering carefully before you do. One thing that's worth at least a brief discussion is the rise of the review-proof game or the never-reviewed game. These are games that sit in a technically unreviewable state for so long that eventually their review becomes kind of a formality. All the AAA ones that I can think of sat in beta for a really long time. But you see this also in the AA and indie space where the game never fully releases. The most famous examples would be Fortnite and Minecraft. They sat in this pre-1.0 state for so long, gathered so much attention, gathered so much buzz, that the reviews, when or if they eventually came, didn't really matter at all, because people had already made their minds up about the titles. So if you feel like the current video game review culture is broken in some way, if you feel like studios are trying to influence the scores they're getting by cherry picking the people that get to do early reviews, you're not wrong. Certainly in other entertainment media, we see similar attempts to control reviews. But in the case of something like movies, because they are pretty short, the ability to completely control it is a lot more limited. You can give early access to the outlets and reviewers that you like and you think are going to give good scores, and that absolutely does happen. But then on the day the movie comes out, all the reviewers that you excluded are also able to go to the movie and quickly turn around a review as well. Now, day of versus next day probably makes a huge difference in terms of the amount of traffic you get, but it's still there early enough to be influencing a huge part of the movie going public. But games are a lot bigger, typically. Games are a lot bigger. So because being on time can determine so much of your traffic, getting early access to have a review that lands on day of launch or even before launch can give you a huge advantage in terms of your traffic. And all of these things are businesses. The media outlets are businesses. The influencers typically are also businesses. They're trying to drive traffic. They're trying to make money. So what can happen for a movie reviewer that's excluded is they get their review up end of day, the day the movie comes out. For a video game reviewer that's excluded, they either have to make the decision to review the game while they're still playing it, which does happen, or they have to delay their review until they've completed it, which might mean the review comes out days or even weeks after the game came out, which still makes that review useful for a lot of people, but it does mean that they are going to be much less in the conversation during the early days of the game's launch. Multiplayer games, when being reviewed, have the additional complexity of matchmaking being part of the review process. So if you get early review codes, you're having to assume that the matchmaking isn't going to be terrible, because there isn't critical mass to really test it. The studios are going to either artificially create the conditions so that you have a decent experience by having a bunch of people at the studio play, or you're just going to have a bad experience. Live service games also have the additional complexity of their economies. Until their economies are actually turned on, you don't really know what the balance of the game is going to feel like. So again, the studio has to fake something. They either have to give you a bunch of items that you otherwise would have had to purchase or grind for, or you're sitting with a really, really painful economy. And these two things can make the review process for this style of game really problematic for early reviews. What you see in some cases is that review sites delay the reviews to give it a proper look under real world conditions. They may start to play, they may get their feet wet, figure out how the game is going to work. They may even write a preliminary impression/review, but not put a number on the game, and then wait to see how it exists in the real world with matchmaking, with the economy turned on before they give it its final score. You may not like how much influence there is over review scores from the people who actually make the games. But I'm not sure how we get to a different world, because ultimately the studios are the ones who get to decide who gets early access. And if early access is really important for the early reviews, then that influence is always going to be there. Ultimately, maybe the way forward is no early reviews. Like we've talked about, you are seeing this to some degree with games that stay in beta forever, with multiplayer games, with live service games, where review outlets are delaying their reviews until after launch to give it a real evaluation under more realistic conditions. But the reality of no early review codes is it basically, for a lot of games, a lot of genres, means no reviews on launch day at all. If your game takes 60 hours to finish, then the soonest you're going to be able to get a review up if you start on launch day is on day 3. And no one really wants that. Players want to have review scores out on day of launch at the latest so they can make an informed buying decision. Similarly, the studios want it out early to help people make that buying decision. But maybe that's where we're headed. Maybe we're headed to more of a world of impressions and vibes as opposed to review score. I don't think so, but maybe. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are interested in supporting the channel in a different way. And we have merch. This is the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie. I will tag that in the video if you're interested in picking something up. Do you consider reviews in making your buying decisions? Do you listen to just one review? Do you go to Metacritic and look at that score? Is there an influencer whose opinion you value above anything else? Let me know down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.